Okay, Nihilea. A few questions about this possibly risky operation we're going with. First and foremost, if I don't have control over it, then how the hell is it supposed to help me win? I asked, still gazing up at that giant. I mean, ordering the liquid steel to move about is one thing, but trying to tell a sentient thing to do something for you is an entirely different matter. If I'm not in control of it, then how is it going to help me? Don't misunderstand, Kevin, Nihilea replied. Yes, you are not in control of it anymore once you complete the process. However, this does not mean that what you create will not abide your will. In essence, the being that you're going to create will come from you. It understands that on an instinctual level, at least in the experiments that we conducted. The creatures that we created were immediately able to recognize their creator and have an instinctual desire to protect that creator. Not only that, but they also have memory of you. Once it's given intelligence, the ability to reason, it will still maintain its memories of you, interacting with it. All the different ways that you've utilized the liquid up until now. Every time you use your telepathic wavelength to control the fluid, you're essentially feeding it. Only very small amounts, enough to get the reaction that you need. It learns to read your telepathic wavelength, and very rapidly at that. So whatever you create is born with an innate sense of you. It may not understand your motives, your reasoning, but from the moment the fluid is created, it became subject to your will, and your will was ingrained within it every time you used it. Even your intentions, a small portion of that carries through in your telekinetic wavelength, the energy that you feed to it. In order to get it to do your will, it retains that information. Alright, so it'll view me as its creator, in a positive light, I suppose. Yes, Nihilea replied. At least with the test subjects that we created, there was no need to fear the creatures that we made. They have a natural desire to follow your will, simply because they're no longer subject to being controlled by your telekinetic wavelength doesn't mean that they no longer want to do your will. It simply changes from simply being a response to specific thoughts to being a reasoned choice on its part. Okay, I replied. So, I can trust it not to try to kill me, and it will want to help me. That being said, how is it supposed to be any better than just controlling the liquid steel myself? I mean, that seems like it would be just as effective, right? No, not actually, Nihilea replied. Controlling the liquid steel, for you, is like a talent. It's something that you develop. It's not something that you have an innate ability for. It's a skill that you have to work at. Think of it like this. How much thought do you actually put into moving your body, to breathing when you want to? Do you actually think about making your heart beat, or does it simply do so? That is the difference between controlling the liquid steel and the liquid steel moving of its own accord, doing as it wishes. It's the difference between learning how to be a puppeteer and moving your own body. One is simply second nature. You don't have to think about it at all. In events of high intensity, people can always note that their bodies often move before they have time to think about anything. It's reflex, instinct. Once you give the liquid steel its own life, the same rules will apply. It doesn't need the focus you do in order to control its own body. To it, moving, shifting, changing, all of these things are in its nature, part of its very essence, its physical being. In other words, the being that you create is essentially born with complete and utter mastery of using that liquid steel body of its, where you have to focus and concentrate. It can react on instinct, intuition, reflex, faster than lightning. You'll find that once you create it, its abilities to utilize the liquid steel will far surpass your own. However, the being you create will not have control over all liquid steel. It will only be able to control the liquid steel that comprises its own body. But I assure you that's more than enough for one who has absolute mastery of it. Okay, I replied. So, we have a game plan, so let's get to it, I said, raising my hands up, beginning to gather all of the liquid steel that I had scattered around. The liquid steel attached to the boulder. I even pulled back the liquid steel binding Rebecca's leg, forcing it to drill its way out after releasing her. Rebecca looked down, watching the liquid steel flow into the ground she stood on that was made of that giant creature, and then bore its way out, flying back to my side. Oh, so you do have something up your sleeve, do you? You're even willing to let go of your little bondage trick. Well, let's hope it's impressive, because you just gave up a major tactical advantage for it. Because now I can move about freely as much as I want, she said as the liquid steel gathered in front of me. That 4-foot wide steel sphere floating. Okay, Nylea, how do I pull the trigger on this? The process isn't complicated, Nylea replied. It's simply exceptionally taxing. Mentally, this is going to be a challenge. I think you can achieve it, but only just, and it's going to push you to the absolute limit to do it. If you can, that is. Simply place your hands on the orb, and then focus on creating a pulse of telekinetic energy, forcing it into the orb, and then do it again, and again, and again, as many times as you can, as fast as you possibly can, and as intense as you possibly can. The telekinetic energy will begin to ricochet, bouncing back and forth inside of the liquid steel sphere that you created, rippling back and forth, bouncing off of each other sporadically. The more you do it, the more it'll intensify, the harder it'll be to force your kinetic wavelength into it, and thus the more force will be required to do so. The amount of telekinetic energy that will be created by this process is immense, so you can get started whenever you're ready. Okay, I said, raising my hands and placing them on the sphere. It's go time. I focused as hard as I could, beginning to press jolts of my telekinetic wavelength into the sphere. As I did, visible ripples began to flow across the outside of its surface, like dropping a stone in water. One after another, I started pulsing my telekinetic wavelength over and over again, trying to push as much as I possibly could in. You have to move faster, Nylea said. The speed isn't high enough. Okay, I replied, focusing even harder, increasing the frequency of the pulses. I could see all of the waves bouncing around inside of the sphere, rippling the surface in every direction, like the sphere was getting hit with rain, rippling all over. As I did, I began to feel a vibration start to emit from the orb, like tremors shaking the air. I could even see stones on the ground starting to jump around a bit, and I just kept pouring it on, more and more, faster and faster, more intense with every second. I was focusing so hard, I started to get dizzy. My head started to hurt, but Nylea already said this was going to push the limit. But I had to give it everything, or it wouldn't work. So I kept pouring it on, and the more I did, the more I began to see the effects. The orb began to emit light, white light, surges of what looked like electricity darting across the surface, ebbing off onto the ground. Before I knew it, I was focusing so hard I was screaming, yelling with every ounce of energy I could, trying to force my telekinetic wavelength into this sphere. I even started to feel my nose bleeding. The tremors were just getting more and more intense as the surges of what looked like electricity began to ebb off onto the armor, running up my arms. Small amounts of the liquid steel that comprised my armor even started to liquefy, tiny little drops lifting off of my arms. "It's all right, Kevin," Nylea said. "The telekinetic wavelength you're producing is very intense. It's starting to destabilize the structure that you gave when you put together the armor. It's a side effect that I didn't see coming. My last bearer didn't wear armor. But it doesn't matter. You're too far in now. You have to keep going." I didn't second guess her at all. I just kept pressing. More. Focusing as hard as I could as that light just grew more intense. The vibrations beginning to shake everything around me. The surges of electricity bolting off more intensely. And the ripples seeming to encompass the entire sphere were beyond count. Before I realized it, there was wind, like an outward burst of wind flowing out from the orb. It felt like it was trying to press me back, and putting in energy into the orb was getting harder by the second. It kept costing more. Before I knew it, the blinding white light was overwhelming, but my vision was starting to fade. Everything was going dark. I was pushing it, using so much telepathic energy that my brain just couldn't handle it. I was starting to black out, but in the moments right before I went out, there was a burst of brilliant white light and heat, vibrations that shook me, and I saw a shape. The sphere started to change. As I blacked out for a second, by the time that my vision started to come back, I was laying on the ground, looking up. I began to try to pick myself up, and as I did, standing there in front of me was a strange being. It was obvious that it was made of liquid steel, but strangely enough, it looked like it was trying to mimic a human form, but it had a strange form and shape to it, like water trying to maintain the shape of a person, ebbing and flowing in different directions. What looked like its head turned and looked at me laying on the ground. There were no expressions, no features. I mean, it was shaped like a person, but it definitely didn't look anything like one. For a moment, it cocked its head, looking at me with a curious expression, like it was contemplating something. It began to take steps towards me. In the moment, I was completely blown back. I could still feel blood running down my face. It was dripping out of my helmet onto my armor. For a moment, I almost felt fear as it reached down in my direction. But something stopped it from being fear, like its movement almost felt gentle as it placed one of its two hands, I suppose, on the side of my helmet, glaring down at me. A face with no eyes or mouth, no ears or hair, and yet somehow I could feel it. A sensation like concern. It was concerned for my well-being, and I could feel it. And suddenly, I heard what sounded like an avalanche as I looked to the side to see a massive arm tearing away stone and earth as it flew in our direction. I almost started to get up, thinking I had to move out of the way, dodge this, but my limbs were still too shaky to pull myself up as it headed in our direction. But this strange entity standing in front of me simply turned to the side for a moment, raising one of its arms, and in a motion that was simply too fast for me to really see what happened. It seemed to stretch out and extend, but in what way and how I couldn't really tell you. was just too fast. And in a flash, the massive stone hand grinding its way towards us was dashed to pieces, flying into bits of rubble. And even the bits of rubble flying in our direction seemed like they were getting cut, slashed, broken down into smaller segments or pushed out of the way, like an entire avalanche just hit some sort of invisible wall, rolling right over us, but not actually touching us, like the earth was moving in a sphere around us, an invisible barrier of God knows what. And as it finally came to an end, I saw its arm retracting, the arm of the entity standing in front of me, beginning to coalesce back into its original shape, what seemed like a blade, double-sided and curved in different directions, bending and flowing like water, or a streamer of some kind, dissipating back into its liquid form and shaping the arm of this creature. That was most definitely impressive, and a far shot from anything I'm able to do. My Leia definitely made the right call, at least for the moment, I thought, staring up at this being kneeling over me.